Film club.
This is literally the same thing. This film is like you and I at the Weatherspoons after everyone else has cleared out.
And I'm like, please can we leave because they're on to us.
Thank you very much for joining this episode of Film Club. I'm one of your hosts, Andy Harrison. To my right, as always, it's the Mugless, Andy Dawson.
Oh, right.
What's your mug?
I've had loads of water today, so I don't want to go for a loo halfway through the interview.
This is not water, this is coffee.
It's vodka.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Why are you
Andy,
doing it?
we have had a week of conversation because this week...
Felt like a fucking week of conversation.
We had my dinner with Andre. Not specifically my dinner, but Andre's dinner with not Michael Shaw.
Wallace
Shaw, every time. What
Wallace
is
Shaw,
my dinner with Andre all about?
Wallace Shawn decides to go and meet his friend and playwright, play director, Andre. It is Andre Gregory. And he comes up and you have a little bit of narration by Wallace going, I'm not too fond of this guy. He was in the industry, then he kind of like went out. Then it proceeds to a conversation with Andre, which is all about his vision of life, how he left what he had and he went for more like kind of an experimental kind of theatre approach and like actually living in the present, you are living as the actor and things like that, with a bunch of anecdotes that all come back to this kind of conversation, this debate about, do you dare live in normal society where you could be perceived as a machine, or do you dare like live outside the box and have each day as a new one?
Yep. And I don't think I expected this to be as
intense.
Yeah, that's a fair word to say. Like as intense as it actually was.
I described it because I had a little bit to finish off. I mean, I watched a lot of it before, but I had a little bit to finish off, and I was with my mate. And he goes, what are we doing? I was like, I'm film club, yeah, just finish off this film. I went, fuck me, mate. I went, yeah. I explained the film. It's 2 hours of a conversation with this like that, and it's literally the camera work is just between them two. There's nothing else. They don't move up, they don't change besides the end. And it's like that, and he goes, in his voice, he goes, fucking hell, mate, that sounds shit, that. Like, I won't fucking dare. And I was like, yeah, it's fair play. Like, you kind of like see outside the box and actually see past it, but at the same time, I can like empathise with his... the word that you use in this perception, because on paper it sounds horrifying. It is better than it sounds, but it is a fucking struggle.
See, I think actually the other way around. To me, on paper, this sounds so cool, and the execution of it leaves a little bit to be desired. Because on paper, this sounds like Locke.
Oh my god! Comparison there to Locke. That's a really good point.
Two people. One location, sitting and having a conversation, and let's look at the obvious excellent thing this thing has going for it is its script. This is written to like perfection. Like, oh my god, the conversation they have is deep. It stretches the idea of like human experience, and it has a sort of philosophical nature that runs throughout the entire thing.
Philosophical.
Very. This is like. It's like a film that's made up of those conversations you have with somebody at 4 a.m. after you've had like way too many drinks.
That we've had many times.
Yeah, and you're both sitting there with probably whiskey in hand.
A nice little frog.
Going way too deep into a lot of things. But this is people who are completely cognizant and engaging in that on like on an intellectual and philosophical level. It's wonderful. And you also get this sort of like subtle writing technique of a character arc for Wallace Shawn's character, because he goes into this thing being like, I'm not going to talk to this guy, I'm just going to ask questions and like eat my food and I'll be out of there as soon as possible. And by the end, he's like totally engaged in this conversation. He's been swept up in the whole thing. He's engaged in the
conversation. I won't say he's engaged in what it has to offer.
Oh, yeah. So there's a difference between somebody being engaged in the conversation and somebody agreeing with the other person.
But I feel like he has every right to be engaged in the conversation, because almost on the other hand, when Andrew goes on about his experiences, he does it in whether or not he means it maliciously. He kind of like he mentions like he kind of condescends Wallace quite a bit in his lifestyle and say like, why are you doing that, as if say like you just. I know it's like, I can't understand now. I've got this new experience. You should join it, but and it kind of leads to not my issue throughout the film, but my issue throughout the film. It's not huge, but it is, and it's that. At the very start, a bit like Wallace, because I'm on Wallace's side here, right? For the majority of it, I'm on Wallace's side. you're amazed, you're engaged. Andre's like talking like this stuff, and I mean, the way how he does it, like actually holds himself and remembers his lines and does all that is fucking fantastic, isn't it? But the more anecdotes he goes on, the more ways he tries to relate stuff together. I mean, this guy's an intellectual through and through, right? But the more ways he tries to get to his point forward and using all these kind of like different, he meanders the conversation, he goes on these different tangents to lead back to the point that he's at hand. Fair play, but it gets fucking towards the end. I'm getting sick of it, and I'm thinking, look, you're raising a good point. You raise your point, but you could do that in a much smaller amount of time. Whether or not that's to do with the script, the actual film, whether it's to do with the way it's been presented, how they want it to go. And I'm thinking, you're talking for the sake of talking, and I don't mean that in a bad way. And it's a hard thing to do because, like I said, it is very intellectual film. It's a very philosophical experience in the way he's talking. But towards the end, I'm thinking, you keep mentioning this point, but you're not setting the bar any higher. You stay in this level about where you are and how you are and why you believe in that way. But it's like, where does this then lead to? You aren't changing Wallace's mind halfway through.
It would be cool to have some sort of a bit of a back and forth between the two.
Yeah.
Like you're right. He raises the bar. Wallace raises the bar. He raises the bar. Like there's a back and forth,
which would be
push
great.
and a pull.
I mean, that is a debate.
I think that's what I mean. There is a push and a pull for Wallace, but not for Andre.
Exactly, it's like 75% Andre and 25% Wallace.
And you feel that, especially in the first third, where like you get these long, lengthy shots of Andre giving these monologues. Then you cut to Wallace for a second, where he'll just nod, and then it cuts back to Andre for a long. And yeah, you're right. It does start to feel it after a while. And I could see how somebody would want to maybe cut down the amount of stories that are told by like one or two. Like just
I wouldn't say the stories because he has all these stories, but it's when he goes later on, he goes on about this experience. It's his whole idea of it's living in the moment. It's like, why should you do this? Why should you subject yourself to this kind of job where it's monotonous? You're doing the same tasks every day. Why should you be at home and do the ironing together with your wife when you could be fresh, you could be free and everything like that? I've just said, I mean, there's a lot more to it, but I've just said a basic principle, what his whole argument, his conversation's about in that space of time. And yes, I could do anecdotes and I could relate all my points to anecdotes and maybe expand them quite a bit, but it doesn't take 2 hours.
True, but I think there's something to be said for every journey when it comes to writing. This is clearly a writer's film. And in a similar sense, 2001: A Space Odyssey is about evolution. And that didn't take 2 hours to talk about.
But 2000...
And so you can boil everything down in a sense, but it's the journey and the sort of... the structure and the textual complexity of like what they do with the words is the fascinating part of My Dinner with Andre. And watching this sort of not even a back and forth, but watch this wordsmith kind of craft imagery for you, and that you experience these things that you never see. Now, my problem with it, I think, is they could have done more. Technically, they could have done more with the soundscape.
So when you're going back to, I'm sorry to interrupt, but 2001.
No, I'm not going to let you interrupt.
But 2001, though.
Yeah,
that's what you're saying.
So, I mean, to be fair, my analogy is not apples to apples. Those are vastly different films.
Yeah,
vastly different films. Now, what I would like to have seen was, Locke kept you moving at all times.
Yeah,
I don't think this film needs to keep you moving at all times, but a lot of it is actually the exact same shot, time and time again. Like not even a slight variation. There are big chunks of this film which are the exact same shot, time and time again. With a couple exceptions. There's that wonderful story where he's telling Wallace about the scary experience he had in getting buried alive, the feeling of getting buried alive.
Is this when it zooms in?
And the camera tracks and tracks
so
and tracks and tracks and tracks. And then right at the point of climax, it cuts out wide to make it this feeling of like, wow, we've been sucked into this story, and now we're back in the restaurant.
Yeah.
And now we're releasing.
See, I like those bits. I like how the camera subtly changed, and you see like you can tell when it's tracking in something. That picture frame is getting smaller and smaller in the top left corner.
But it's few and far between. Now, the other thing I do really like in this actually is the background. I love just these subtle touches of making that restaurant feel alive, and like having people pass through the frame at certain moments, and having a couple people in the background who are also in, like, you can see them in the reflections, they're having dinner at the same time. And then as the film goes on, they strip those elements back.
What
It
to know
becomes
that it's
quieter.
like, yeah.
And they just start to make things a little bit, in a really subtle way, they just strip everything back until you start to sit. And as the conversation's wrapping up, you think, oh, they're on their own now. And yeah, obviously you get that moment at the end where they cut wide and you go, shit, yeah, like there's no one else left in the restaurant at all.
In regards to the philosophical conversations in the film, I mean, it's going a slight thing about film club, we're on about philosophy for a second. Where do you stand?
On what?
So let's just go of like A to B, yeah? Let's just say obviously there's a middle ground. I mean, I'm kind of in the middle ground, but let's just say there's an A to B, which is one side, which is are you happy in the life you're at, where you're Wallace, you do your routine for the fear, for not, you're worried about doing this and that. Like there's other parts to it as well. Or do you go to Andre, where you want to live each day as it is, you want new experiences like the monk and everything like that. We could sit at a conversation and no one to speak and it would be all right. Whereas Wallace would feel like, no, that I think something's up. Which kind of side do you stand on?
In that horrible political answer, which is somewhere in the middle.
Cool.
Which is, I think
that's the right answer.
I think people shouldn't be in any way ashamed, and I don't think anybody should ever be belittled for living a smaller, simpler life that they are comfortable with. But at the same time, I think that people should always try and understand and at least absorb a larger scale environment and experience.
Do you know how Andre sometimes comes to me? He comes across in certain periods, especially when he's being condescending and he doesn't realise, comes across ever so slightly naive. Like he's too drawn into these new kind of like these scenarios. He's just, it's almost like he's on like, for lack of a better analogy, he's on a train chase. He's jumping from carriage to carriage to look at his next experience. He's like, everyone's, oh shit, what do we do next? Oh, I'm going to do this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And like, for me, he's like, is that truly living? Like, it's not a fear, it's an excitement of the next thing, but at the same time, there's no staple. I mean, look at him, he's left his, I mean, by the way, it's not actually their lives, it is like fictionalized version of themselves, I should point.
Yeah.
But then he's like left his wife for ages, and like, I know that like the monk lives with them and stuff like that, but then it's potentially jeopardizing their whole relationship for the fact they have this monk and everything like that. So I think he sacrifices way too much for this amazing feeling of fulfillment, and that leads to a conversation. Not that he tries to make people jealous, he doesn't do that, but he does condescend, whether or not that's as I said, maliciously. I don't think it is. Whereas Wallace, he does live quite sheltered, and I think you're absolutely right in the middle line. And the reason I say this is I had this really good conversation when I lived in a flat with my mate Alex, not the one you know. I feel like Andrew and myself talking.
I know the other Alex, by the way, just as a side note.
Yeah, you do. And it was a really funny night, so we had a few beers like this Friday night, just finished work. And he played GTA 5, and we had this amazing experience. It lasted, actually, weirdly, this is one thing I thought about when I was going to the film. We had like 5 hours of this conversation, this debate. And it was funny because to be fair, I was trolling him halfway through. And all he did on GTA 5 was go around all the motorways and everything like that and just drive around. His side of the conversation is, if you could put all the people in the world that are creatively minded artists, and it's a hard thing to imagine, creative minded, and everyone who's like engineers and like scientists and everything like that, logically minded, who would prevail and all this? And I'm thinking, all right, it's quite a good conversation. He was very like A and B like that. And he was like absolute engineer's logic, people aside and everything like that. Like, you wouldn't have a world that exists, and how would it be able to like fuel and like have the amount of food available for that, like 3.5 billion. And I was just going, well, I'd say they wouldn't thrive, because it goes to what Andre's saying about like there'd just be a drone nation, like without creativity you'd just be like basically robots, which is what Andre says. And it was an interesting like comparison between mine and Alex's conversation. I mean, in the end, I agree with him. It would be because I'm a bit of a logical person. It would be logic that would prevail. But my point is, like, I was trying to like play the devil's advocate to say to Alex, like, creative minded people do kind of make a difference. They add personality to what makes humanity. Like, again, what Andrew's saying.
Yep. Yeah. The argument is always like, okay, the technically minded people would prevail for longer, but who would have a more enjoyable life?
Exactly. Yeah. And this is what I was trying to say about. Oh my god, he was getting so angry. And at the end, I was like, I do agree with you, Alex, but I just thought I'd just play devil's advocate. You were a fucking dick. Yeah. Great time. But yeah, it was interesting. Another thing, I think it's quite interesting. This film's 81. It draws a lot of what
1981.
1981. Yep. Sorry, yeah. Mindfulness. If you've heard that term, I think it was spoke about a few times.
Yeah, thank you. I'm aware of mindfulness.
All right, okay. Mindfulness. Yeah, some people aren't though. A lot of people aren't.
I trust our audience is very intelligent and all understand what mindfulness is.
I didn't know until a couple of years ago. But live in the moment, everything like that. And I feel like it's cheers. I feel like it's for such an older film, it's interesting how it's actually broaching that subject and everything like that.
Yeah.
For something that's actually quite a huge movement now, people like kind of in that mindset, and I think that is kind of the middle ground at the moment. You live your sheltered life, but if you approach a little bit of mindfulness and like kind of think about the moment that you're in, then you actually fall into that like the best of both parties, and I don't know.
So anyway, on that note, there is my dinner with Andre, and also there is Andy's GTA session with Alex. You can let us know in the comments below what you thought of my dinner with Andre, or you can hit us up on Twitter, as always. And we'll be back once again next week with the last normal episode we'll be doing before Christmas. We may have one more. We'll have to check the calendar. Where we're going to be taking a look at...
2 hours of a conversation, so we decided to do a film called The Conversation.
The Conversation. You can join us next week. We promise the next one isn't just 2 hours of a conversation. It's a really interesting film. We'll see you next week for The Conversation. See you then.